Hello everyone, welcome to Chapter 5, Middle and Late Childhood. Let's get into it. Okay, brain development. So our two big takeaways here is that we see two major brain growth spurts which occur during middle and late childhood, and it's related to myelination, which again deals with the efficiency and the speed in which neural networks communicate and allow for complex behavior. Two specific regions that I want to highlight are the frontal lobes, which are implicated in logic, planning, and memory, and the hippocampus, which is responsible for transferring information from the short-term to the long-term memory. Sports. Higher levels of satisfaction with family and overall quality of life in children. They improve physical and emotional development, and is also linked to better academic performance. Now, I want to highlight some barriers for certain groups to playing sports. And that is, gender, poverty, location, ethnicity, and disability can limit the opportunities to engage in sports. Children in suburban neighborhoods had a much higher participation of sports than boys and girls living in rural or urban centers. White American girls and boys participate in organized sports at higher rates than minority children. So we see these protective factors, these developmental benefits from sports, but like everything, poverty, location, ethnicity, and disability prevents individuals from accessing those critical resources needed from development. Girls were more likely to have never participated in any type of sports. Boys rate their fathers as their biggest mentor who taught them the most about sports, while girls rate their coaches in physical education teachers as their key mentors. So just access to sports for girls will improve their likelihood of participating, obviously, but also maintaining that participation because they derive so much mentorship from coaches. Only Oregon and the District of Columbia meet PE guidelines of a minimum of 120 minutes per week of physical activity in elementary school and 225 minutes in middle school. So even though we see these associations between positive outcomes for participating in sports, and like I said, some of these positive outlines outlined here, very few, the super minority, we have one state, achieve the recommended amount of exercise, playtime necessary to help spur those developmental advancements. And this is a chart. I'm not going to kind of go through this, but this kind of highlights the differences in participations by race and by gender. Esports. Esports is a form of competition with the medium being video games. Players use computers or specific video game consoles to play video games against each other. Downward trend in the number of sports children are engaged in. And specializing in only one activity can increase the chance of injury. Study found that 49% of athletes specialized in a single sport experienced an injury, compared with 23% of those who played multiple sports. So I'm just kind of introducing this concept of esports, which, in this historical period, obviously 40 years ago, there wasn't a big esports around Pac-Man. But with the advent of various PlayStations, faster internet speed, etc., now we have entire networks dedicated to esports, and people like me who are quite mediocre at NBA 2K participate in them. And at the bottom, basically what we're getting at here is that not only does sports help developments or aid the development of cognitive, social, social and cognitive development, it also aids in physical development. And by specializing in more than one sport, you're working out different parts of your body, which allows for greater kind of overall strength, which can lead to a lessening of injuries, especially among children. All right, so let's look at childhood obesity, and I just kind of threw a few environmental factors together that contribute to obesity, and that's inactive lifestyles, portion sizes, fat content, sugar, stress, poverty. So like everything, poverty is associated with a wide variety of negative outcomes. It's a risk factor for a lot of reasons. Just for having the ability to get your child to practice, having the ability to pay for leagues, buy sports equipment, etc. And stress, which we talked about in the last chapter, is linked to unhealthy eating. You're stressed out. We all understand this. You have a stressed out day and you're like, screw it, I'm going to go get some McDonald's. Children who ate more saturated fats perform worse on relational memory tasks, while eating a diet high in omega-3 fatty acids promoted relational memory skills. Animal studies have found that large amounts of processed sugar and saturated fats weaken the blood-brain barrier, especially in the hippocampus. So the takeaway here is that the foods that you eat have neurological effects, which should be pretty straightforward. And healthier food that you eat has positive neurological effects, and in this case, cognitive effects, that is better relational memory skills. And not only that, but it can weaken the blood-brain barrier. So it kind of knocks down, these, metaphorical shields, that blood-brain barrier that protects the brain from, illnesses, just any potential harmful substances reaching it. Well, the food you eat can weaken or, strengthen that barrier, which is implicated in a number of chronic illnesses. Recommendations. The APA developed a clinical practice guidelines, family-based multi-component behavioral interventions to treat obesity in overweight children that age between 2 and 18 years of age. So between 2 to 18 years of age. They recommend counseling on diet, physical activities, and teacher-parent strategies for problem-solving monitoring behaviors. So kind of a family-based multi-component approach, as I outlined here. So you're targeting dieting, targeting physical activity, and getting parents and teachers on the same page. Cognitive development in middle, late childhood. Concrete operational stage, mastering the use of logic in concrete ways to solve problems in the physical world. So this is one of Piaget's stages, and now we're seeing that children are able to use logic, but they can do it kind of only in a tangible way, that is, which can be seen, touched, or experienced directly. So for example, the child can understand principles of cause and effect, size, and distance. Children use inductive reasoning, which is a logical process in which multiple premises believed to be true are combined to obtain a specific conclusion. So what does that mean in English? They draw cause and effect conclusions logically based on factual information presented to them. So, for example, a child has one friend who is rude, another friend who is also rude, and the same is true for a third friend. The child is going to conclude that the friend is rude. So we're having cause and effect here is that if you have a friend, they're going to be rude. And how are they drawing that conclusion? By kind of the information that they have directly experienced, that they've touched, that they've seen. Continuing on the concrete operation stage, we're going to look at two concepts that we looked at earlier in another chapter. And we're kind of going to, as I stated before, we're going to look at the same kind of concepts throughout this book as we're looking at them developmentally in a chronological order. So looking at identity, one feature of concrete operational thought is the understanding that objects have qualities that do not change even if the object is altered in some way. Mass of an object does not change by rearranging it. So if you remember the example of a set of pennies lined up in two rows, so imagine two rows of pennies, each having 5 pennies. Obviously, there's the same amount of pennies in both rows. They both have five pennies in each row. However, for younger children, if you arrange, say, the first row, the pennies more spread out, so spread out the pennies in that single file line, and then in the second row, kind of compact them really close together, the children will believe that the first row, that is the one that is spread out, has more pennies in it. However, at this point in their development, they no longer believe that. Conservation. A tall beaker filled with 8 ounces of water was more than a short, wide bowl filled with 8 ounces of water. Concrete operational children can understand the concept of conservation, which means that changing one quality can be compensated for by changes in another quality. So if you remember, initially, if a child was, and this is kind of like a little bartender trick, if you pour a a short wide bowl of water. Well, you can basically fill up 8 ounces of water in 2 different bowls. One a short wide one, and one a long and narrow cup. And the child will believe that the long narrow cup has more water in it, just due to the kind of the physical characteristics of the cup. The cup being taller means it has more water in it. However, at this stage, they no longer believe that, and they understand that that height and weight of the cup both factor into how much water is within the cup. Pendulum task. Children cannot yet use abstract reasoning. They use a trial and error approach. Child may try a variety of things but fail to test different hypotheses systematically, and cannot use if-then reasoning, vary each factor while holding others constant. So basically this task requires children to answer the question, what makes a pendulum swing faster or slower? Children have the opportunity to construct a pendulum using longer and shorter strings with heavier and lighter weights. Children in the formal operation stage can systematically manipulate various combinations. So you're setting up a pendulum, and you want kind of the pendulum to rock back and forth or remain stationary. And basically the point of this task is that the strings are different sizes, and the weights and the sizes of the weights differ as well. Well, the children's approach to this at this stage would be just kind of a trial and error approach. They're just trying random things. There's no systematic strategy. They would just grab random pieces of string and random weights and try and complete the task. Instead of, okay, I'm going to try each size string one at a time in a systematic way, then I'm going to vary the weights. So kind of this scientific method approach, this systematic approach, this if-then reasoning. That is, if I have a shorter string, maybe I use a lighter weight. If I have a larger string, maybe I use a larger or heavier weight. So the important thing here is not necessarily the task, but that they cannot use this if-then reasoning. Let's look at memory development. 4 major hypotheses about why learning and memory improve at this age. There's changes in basic capacity, such as neurological development. There's changes in memory strategies, such as learning effective strategies for putting information into long-term memory. Increased knowledge about memory, that is, know how long they need to study and how much effort. And increased knowledge about the world. Expertise makes material to be learned more familiar, and familiar material is easier to learn. So let's get into some concrete examples here. Let's look at memory changes. There is no consistent evidence of capacity changes across the lifespan. We have more room for storage than we could use. So the idea here is that not that we've now have necessarily more memory, or that more memory capacity is necessary for these advancements, because we have already more capacity for memory than we could possibly use across our lifespan. The speed of mental processes improves with age. Myelination allows older children and adults to simultaneously perform more mental operations in working memory than younger children. Older children's mental processes become increasingly automatic, freeing up cognitive energy for other novel, challenging tasks. Neural studies indicate that with age, children go from using scattered and general neural activity to specialized areas. So what are our key takeaways here? Again, myelination, a constant theme, is related to performing better on tasks. And this kind of creates this automatic process. So certain parts of tasks become easy for us. They're automatic, they're unconscious. Driving a car for you typically is unconscious. Riding a bike becomes unconscious. For children, reading becomes unconscious, etc. And because that's kind of this unconscious or automatic behavior, that frees up that manual mental cognitive capacities, that mental energy, that cognitive effort is then allowed to be applied to new parts of a task that are more challenging. So because some parts of a task are automatic, children now have freed up kind of cognitive memory or cognitive resources to apply and to use on newer, challenging tasks. So as things become more increasingly automatic, easier basically, you're able to apply your cognitive resources to new and challenging tasks. Information processing, again, myelination and synaptic pruning in the cortex, increasing processing speed and ability to filter out irrelevant stimuli, contributes to higher working memory, inhibition, and shifting attention abilities. Younger children still struggle to complete cognitive flexibility tasks. The ability to switch between mental states, sets of rules, or tasks. So we're going to show an example of that in a second, but again, back to that myelinated or synaptic pruning, I should say, is that through, as we saw in the previous slide, our brain becomes more specialized with time. Children initially use kind of their entire brain. It's kind of this idea, and kind of counterintuitive for some people, that more neural activity means you're performing better. But that's not necessarily the case. What we're looking for here is that efficiency. And efficiency comes through myelination and specialization and synaptic pruning of the brain that allows for quicker, automatic, unconscious processing, and which then allows you to perform and learn new and challenging tasks. But let's look at some of the tasks that children still struggle with, that is cognitive flexibility / shifting tasks. Mental strategies. The likelihood of using a strategy to aid memory increases or is greater when motivated. Children remind you, I want candy. So kind of just the takeaway for that example is that using a strategy is based on how motivated the child is. So if the strategy is nagging the child or nagging their parent until they get candy, they'll be very likely to use that strategy because they're motivated to get the candy. Younger children have a tendency to make preservation errors. Continue to use the same strategy that was successful in the past, despite the strategy's current lack of success. So that is an example of those cognitive flexibilities, that shifting task that I just mentioned in the previous slide. So look to the left-hand side. So this is like very common cognitive flexibility task. So you tell the child, we're going to play a color game. If it's red, it goes here, but if it's blue, it goes there. Here's a red one, where does it go? And then they put the red bunny, and here and there means you put the red bunny into the red boat and the blue bunny into the blue boat. Then you say, okay, we're going to play this cool new silly game, and in the cool new silly game, we're going to do the opposite. And that is we're going to put the red bunny with either a blue boat or the blue bunny, etc. So you're changing the rules, you're making the opposite of what it was in stage one of this game. Well, younger children, and the younger you are, the more likely you are that, or a child is, to make what is called a preservation error. That is, they keep sorting the cards, in this case, or the items, the bunny and the boat, based on the rules in the first stage of the game. That is, red bunny goes with red boat, versus when we just told them that the blue bunny should go with the red boat. So they're unable to shift and be flexible with this rule change. So that's what we're getting at right here. Okay, now let's look at memory. Let's continue on memory, I should say. Children progress through 4 stages to successful strategy use. Mediation deficiency occurs when a child does not grasp the strategy being taught and thus does not benefit from its use. So literally just does not understand the concept. So therefore they can't understand why it's beneficial to use. Production deficiency. The child does not spontaneously use a memory strategy and must be prompted to do so. In this case, children know the strategy and are more capable of using it, but they fail to produce the strategy on their own. So now they know the strategy and they are capable of using it, but they don't use the strategy. They don't produce it on their own. It's a production deficiency. So in the first case, it's that they don't grasp the strategy. Now they grasp the strategy, but really, or kind of grasp the strategy, but the issue is that they're not producing the strategy. Now we have utilization strategy, which is children using an appropriate strategy, but it fails to aid their performance. Utilization strategy is common in the early stages of learning a new memory strategy. Until the use of strategy becomes automatic, it may slow down the learning process as space is taken up in memory by the strategy itself. So this gets back to the slide, a few slides ago, and that is, before a strategy becomes automatic, an unconscious process, it's using the strategy prior to it becoming that unconscious automatic process requires you using more cognitive resources that can actually decrease performance, because you're so focused on using the strategy that you can't really focus on the problem at hand. And then finally, children are able to use the strategy effectively, aka effective strategy. Memory strategies. Organization, classifying items into meaningful groups, chunking. So it works with pi digit memorization, can get digit span memory up to 79 digits. So if I just gave you a list of random letters, which is that top bullet point, but then you can use a strategy, and I asked you, I should say, to memorize that string of letters. You could just try and memorize it blindly, or you can arrange those letters in meaningful groups. That is chunking. So for example, USA, UWF, what WTF, and LOL. And then one individual used the strategy so effectively that they were able to memorize pi up to the 79th digit. Now let's look at knowledge base. Knowledge base is knowledge in particular areas that make learning new information easier. It affects learning and memory performance. So for example, expert chess children perform better than adults on location of chess pieces tasks, but are worse on digital memorization tasks. They are experts, so they have the capability to chunk chess pieces. So the idea here is that children can become experts in a particular specific task. In this case, they could be an expert at chess, and they can chunk. And because of that expertise, they're able to chunk kind of the location of pieces on a board. However, that expertise, that knowledge base, does not carry over to other memorization tasks. It's simply that they become experts at this specific kind of application of memory, this application of chunking, that allows them to perform well on very similar specific tasks, but not on other tasks of memory or location. So they're able to use their expertise in kind of chess piece locations on other tasks that are very similar to their expertise. Increased knowledge of memory, metacognition, knowledge of the human mind and of the range of cognitive processes. Understanding you're better at math and art, knowing that you can't work with Netflix on. Improved metacognition may be one mechanism of reducing preservation errors. They'll slow down to think after shifting roles. So what is metacognition? Again, the knowledge of the human mind and of the range of cognitive processes. It's that idea that you know what you're good at, you know what your weaknesses are, and you know what strategies are effective for you to achieve your goals. An example of this is that if you give an adult a kind of a novel task, something that's challenging that they haven't seen before, they'll slow down, they'll think about it, they'll strategize. While young children, kind of as we saw in that cognitive flexibility task, they'll keep sorting that red bunny or red rabbit, whatever, or bunny, into the blue boat. And they'll do it more quickly. While adults kind of use a strategy of slowing down and understanding that, wait, I don't fully get what's going on in this task. When we slow down, when we think about it. So that's an example of metacognition. Critical thinking. Detailed examination of beliefs, course of actions, and evidence, which involves teaching children how to think. It allows a child to evaluate information in ways that help make informed decisions. Involves better understanding a problem through gathering, evaluating, and selecting information, and also by considering many possible solutions. Can also think of critical thinking in psychology as scientific thinking, because it's a form of thinking that allows us to evaluate scientific claims not only in the laboratory but also in everyday life. So what we're looking at here is teaching how to think, how to critically evaluate the material in front of you, and do so not in an obstinate way where I'm just going to disagree with any authority figure, but do so in a scientific way to evaluate evidence and, going back to that not metacognitive point, understanding what you know, what you don't know, and kind of understanding who may know or what are more credible sources. Is it your classmate in second grade, or is it your father who is, a scientist, for example? And by increasing critical thinking, it allows a child to evaluate information and make better decisions. Expanding language skills. So I'm kind of going over this again because it was mentioned in the textbook, but just basically middle childhood brings increased meta-linguistic awareness, so meta-linguistic, so knowledge of language as a system. Children who are meta-linguistic, who have more meta-linguistic skills, understand the concept of words and can define words. Children can distinguish between grammatical correct and incorrect sentences. So it's kind of just this increased understanding of language globally. And bilingual children have better meta-linguistic skills. Bilingual and metalingual infants remain sensitive to a wider range of sounds, what we've talked about already, may experience a temporary delay, but they catch up and show up more advantages and disadvantages. So bilingualism is associated with many positive outcomes, and we're going to look at some. So let's check this out. Alters the neural connections in the brain. It increases working memory and the ability to ignore irrelevant information. Strengthens higher executive function, executive control components of the cognitive systems, and learning a second language later in life results in different changes in the brain architecture. So again, we've already covered this, but the idea here is that these changes, the bilingualism is evident within neural activity, so you can physically see how the brain is operating differently for children who are bilingual. It increases, just one example is that increases working memory, which is the ability to ignore irrelevant information and keep information temporarily in your brain and kind of be better at problem solving or working on whatever task it is. Increased temporary memory allows you to perform tasks at a higher level because you're able to keep multiple bits of information in your head and kind of like manipulate that information. All right, so moving on, one of the reasons that children can classify objects in so many ways is that they have acquired a vocabulary to do so. By 5th grade, children's vocabulary has grown to 40,000 words. Older children are able to learn new rules of grammar with more flexibility, while younger children are likely to be reluctant to give up saying, I go there. Older children will learn this rather quickly. So going back again to what we already talked about is that children are acquiring and are able to acquire a better understanding of rules, of grammar, of syntax because of that increase in metalinguistic skills. Let's look at intelligence. What is intelligence? Well, one of my favorite quotes from this is psychologist Edwin Boring, ironically enough. Intelligence is whatever intelligent test measures. Why is that? Because psychologists cannot agree on one simple definition of intelligence. And we're going to review kind of different conceptions of intelligence and theories behind intelligence. So we have the psychometric approach, which spawns the development of standardized tests of intelligence. Intelligence is a trait or a set of traits that characterizes some people to a greater extent than others, and the goal is to identify these traits. So psychometric approach, intelligence trait, and then we're going to figure out what is going on here. What are these traits, and how do we measure them precisely? Let's look at two psychologists or scientists who took the psychometric approach. That is Bennett and Simon. They devised a large battery of tasks and were commissioned by the French government to devise a task to identify, quote, dull children who might need additional instruction in classrooms. They devised tasks which they thought were necessary for classroom learning. And those tasks focused on attention, perception, memory, reasoning, and verbal comprehension. It was the forerunner of the modern IQ test. And they were interested in mental age, that is the level of age-created problems that the child is able to solve. 5-year-olds expect to be able to solve tasks for 5-year-olds. So they kind of developed tasks for each age, for example, and they said within this age, whatever, we'll say 5 years old, you should be able to solve and complete tasks that are assigned to your age group. You can therefore have a higher mental age. So if you're a 5-year-old who are completing 8-year-old tasks, then you have a mental age of 8, for example. Or say you're an 8-year-old and you're only able to complete tasks from when you're for 6-year-olds, then you would have a mental age of 6, is what they would argue. Distribution of scores. Normal distribution, a symmetrical bell-shaped spread around the average score, in this case 100. Standard deviation is the measure of variability that takes into account how far each data point is from the mean, how tightly the scores are clustered. So normal distribution, so we have kind of the bell curve, which you should be familiar with. And the standard deviation is how much a particular score is from the mean. So you can be 1 standard deviation away, 2 standard deviations away, 3 standard deviations away. And the idea here is as that number of standard deviation gets larger, the further you are from the mean. A positive standard deviation would be higher, so you would be, X amount of percentage above the mean, while kind of a negative standard deviation would be below the mean. So 1 standard deviation, whatever, X percentage below the mean. Nearly 95% of scores score between 70 and 130 on this test. Fewer than 3% of scores score higher of score 130 or above on these IQ tests, and fewer than 3% have IQ scores below 70, which is cut off for intellectual disability. So what we're doing here, we're creating a bell curve based on the total population scores of, we'll say not going to be 5-year-olds, but we'll say 10-year-olds. And then based on that total, 10,000 10-year-olds, we create a bell curve. And then following the creation of that bell curve, we have individuals take the task and we say, where do you fall on that distribution? Where do you fall on that bell curve? Are you average? Are you above average? Are you below average? And those above averages and below averages are measured kind of through standard deviation, which tells us how many or how much percent above or below the mean you are. And again, 95% of scores are between 70 and 130 on this IQ test. Now moving on to Gardner's theory of multiple intelligence. Gardner rejects IQ score as a measure of human intelligence. He argues that there are entirely different domains of intellectual skill. Individuals have each type of intelligence to varying degrees and prefer to learn and process information in different ways. Gardner's frames of minds, different ways of thinking about the world. Each frame of mind is different and fully independent intelligence in its own right. Argues that there's a neurological evidence that distinct types of intelligence relate to distinct structures and networks in the brain. So we're going to get into the specific types of intelligence, but the framework here is that there's not just one IQ score. There's not what's referred to as a G score. You have just one specific intelligence that applies across all domains of intellectually challenging circumstances or tasks, etc. But you have different domains of intelligence, and you vary. You can be really good at one of the domains, but really bad at another domain. And you have different ways of thinking, and he says neurologically you can see evidence that when some people perform a specific task, so for example, a musical task, they're using different brain networks versus mathematical tasks. But let's get into more specifics and look at Gardner's specific types of intelligence. Now, Gardner argued for 8 types of intelligence: linguistic, math, music, spatial, body, interpersonal, intrapersonal, and naturalistic. He has recently considered a 9th type, existentialist, with the ability to grasp deep philosophical ideas. So looking at these types of intelligence, can you see some things that you may be great at and other things that you're bad at? Well, Gardner, is basically making that argument that we're good, that you can be great at some parts or some specific domains of intelligence. You can have high interpersonal intelligence, but poor intrapersonal intelligence. Now let's look at the triarchic theory of successful intelligence. Sternberg proposed a triarchic theory of intelligence, which is practical, creative, analytic. So there's 3 components, and those are it. Analytical is kind of book smarts, practical street smarts, creativity, or creative is kind of creativity. But we'll cover them all more in detail shortly. To fully assess intelligence, researchers must consider the practical context, ability to respond creativity to new tasks, and their analytic strategies. So, Sternbergs theory is that you have these three components of intelligence, and it's really that ability to respond to new tasks, to be creative, to develop analytic strategies. And the only way that you can understand what is kind of that flexibility, that ability to respond creatively to new tasks, that ability to be analytic, you have to understand the culture, the historical period, and age of the individual. Because certain strategies may be useful in certain historical periods or cultural contexts, but not in others. Let's look at the first component. That is the practical component. What is defined as intelligent behavior varies depending on the social cultural context. People can adapt to the environment that they find themselves in, and they can shape the environment to optimize their strengths and minimize their weaknesses. This deals with street smarts, the ability to solve real-world problems. Intelligence changes over time, and numerical abilities may not play an important role in intelligent behavior. Today is one example. So your ability to perform your multiplication, your nines times table, for example, would be one historical real-world problems example. And that is, because you have a calculator, you have a phone, you're able to calculate what 6% of 20. So you have a 6% tax, and you want to know how much you're ultimately paying. Well, you can just pull out your calculator, for example. So intelligence is tied to the historical period and is tied to the social cultural context. And you can act on that context, as stated, in ways that strengthen and optimize your strengths and minimize your weaknesses. So it's your ability to adapt to the environment as well as shape the environment by using your street smarts / your ability to solve real-world problems. That is what the practical component is. It's practical in a specific and its historical and cultural context. The creative component. What is intelligence when a person first encounters a new task and is not the same as what is intelligence after extensive experience? Novel tests are the best way to measure intelligence because they tap into ability to come up with creative ideas or fresh insights, composing an emotional or moving poem. So what the argument here is that it's not that intelligence is your ability to perform a task that you have a lot of experience in. So maybe taking the same kind of test over and over again, practicing the SATs over and over again, practicing this specific skill, but it's your ability to be creative when faced with a new challenge or to produce something creative. That is what intelligence is. And that's what's encompassed in this component of the triarchic theory of intelligence. Automation. This is increased efficiency of information processing with practice. Sternberg argues it is critical to know how familiar a task is to a person before assessing their person's behavior. Cultural biases are introduced when administering tasks which one group is familiar with. So for example, for the SAT again, or the GRE, which is kind of a test you take to get into graduate school, or for some graduate school programs, as you say. If you are familiar with those kind of tasks, so say I administer the SAT to two different individuals, one who's very familiar with standardized testing, they've practiced with the SAT, they've taken test prep courses, they spent thousands of dollars getting ready for the task, or for this test, versus someone who's never taken a standardized test, has no idea what the SAT is. Well, Sternberg is arguing, it's critical to understand how familiar that person is with that task, because familiarity matters, and it's not because familiarity matters. It's not just what is intelligence. It's not how well someone performs on that SAT task because they're so familiar with it. There's different experiences we're bringing to the table. It's how we respond to a new novel task. So say we created the SAT-2 that no one has ever seen before, and it's a different task. That would be a truer measure of intelligence, and specifically the creative component of intelligence. Now let's look at the analytic component. It's the ability to reason logically or book smarts. IQ tests, college admission exams. Argued it's only one component of intelligence and not necessarily the most crucial. Focuses on information processing skills that produce answers to questions in traditional intelligent tests, thinking critically and analytically. So this is kind of what people generally think of as, intelligence. But Sternberg argues that this is just one component of intelligence, as we just detailed. So what does make up successful intelligence? What is successful intelligence, according to Sternberg? That is, it is the ability to establish and achieve reasonable goals consistent with your skills and circumstances. That is, your historical, social, geographic, and economic circumstances. If you're living in a historical period where you have, and you're poor, and you live in, someplace cut off from the rest of the world, it's not reasonable and it's to expect that person to be great at advanced calculus, for example. Rather, it's your ability to establish and achieve reasonable goals given your specific circumstances and your skills. Successful intelligence involves optimizing your strengths and weaknesses and minimizing your weaknesses. It's the ability to adapt to the environment through a combination of selecting a good environment and making modifications to yourself or the environment to increase fit. And you use all three components of intelligence. So, in Sternberg's opinion, intelligence is really this adaptive process by which we understand our strengths, understand our weaknesses, we select environments that optimize those strengths and weaknesses, and we modify the environment to increase our fit, which means is kind of the matching of our environment with our skills. And this all takes place in specific historical, social, and geographic and cultural context. All right, let's look at creativity. Often measured using tests of divergent thinking, outside the box thinking, capacity to generate many different solutions to problems where there is no single answer, uses for objects tests. Participants must generate as many uses for an ordinary object, like a paperclip or a brick, as they can. So in this theory of intelligence, this is not a Sternberg theory, but kind of a creative approach to intelligence, or where they're defining creativity as a form of intelligence, and specifically divergent thinking, again, thinking outside the box, and just thinking of many solutions to different to a single problem. So you're presented with a problem and you're thinking of multiple solutions. So which is, one example would be uses for objects tests. So participants must generate as many uses for an ordinary object. So I hand you a paperclip and I say, okay, tell me how many uses for a paperclip you can think of, and you're just generating uses. So it's thinking outside the box, thinking outside what the original design of that paperclip is. It can kind of be thought of as kind of a life hacks situation that you see on TikTok. Compared to convergent thinking, finding the single best answer to a problem, the capacity to find the best answer to the problem, want to know the correct answer, only mildly correlated with IQ, 0.3 or 0.2. So we have convergent and divergent thinking, and convergent thinking is finding that best solution. So I give you a paperclip, and I'm like, what is a paperclip? And you tell me, well, it's best designed for putting pieces of paper together. Versus divergent thinking, which would be finding novel solutions or multiple solutions for, or I should say, uses for that paperclip. And if you remember our kind of correlation coefficients, would range from -1 to 1, what this is showing here is that there's only a mild correlation between convergent thinking and divergent thinking and standard tests of IQ. The emergence of creativity. So we talked about creativity, we talked about convergent thinking, divergent thinking, but how does it emerge? Well, preschool age children display high levels of divergent thought. That is how many different ideas can be produced. That is ideation fluency. So just a raw number of how many different ideas can be produced. It increases until the 3rd grade, but then declines significantly after 5th grade. Originality, which is to produce the ability to produce original ideas, sharply declines starting in 6th grade. So we have originality, which is, the original idea, a new idea, versus ideation fluency, which is kind of a raw number of ideas that you're generating, even if they've been used before. Well, we see declines in originality starting in the 6th grade. So why is that? Well, some researchers speculate that it could relate to fitting in with groups or most classrooms teach convergent thinking, that is, knowing the correct answer. So when we go to school, we often are tasked with memorizing things, finding the correct answer, really this kind of trivia approach to thinking that de-emphasizes originality, creativity, novel solutions, unique problem solving, and really kind of strips away intrinsic motivation, these researchers argue, which then decreases, kind of through a cumulative effect, the ability to be creative in the classroom or being creative in general. So it's accumulation of this convergent thinking practices and ideologies within a classroom that eventually leads to a drop in originality in children. Moving on to stability of IQ scores during childhood. Around age 4, or on average, fairly strong relationship between early and later IQ test scores. Many children show ups and downs in their IQ scores over the course of childhood. 1 out of every 4 children still show greater than 10-point swings on tests in one study. So kind of what we're getting at here is that IQ are relatively strong, or I should say scores on an IQ test are relatively strong. However, many children show drastic up and down changes in IQ test scores. Why might that be? Because motivation, for example, could be impacting a child's performance on the task. It could be a testing procedure, and it could be the skills being tested by the test. So again, there's specific IQ tests. There's not one theory of intelligence. We have different tests that measure different abilities. So different tests may be measuring different skills, which lead to kind of differing scores on an IQ test. So let's look at some economic predictors of poor child development. So for example, child poverty. Children in unstable homes have most fluctuation in scores, that is IQ scores. Involves low levels of meeting children's basic needs, inadequate health and nutrition, overcrowding, chronic stress, affection and parenting, and lack of opportunity for cognitive stimulation practices. So those wild fluctuations in scores, well, children who come from unstable homes or kind of lower or are in lower classes, aka are lower in the wealth and income brackets, they are more likely to see the highest fluctuation in their scores. And that's because we know that certain aspects of poverty are related to IQ test scores, such as overcrowding, chronic stress, parenting, and kind of the household. Imagine a household without a lot of books, without a lot of stimulation practices. People are distracted by the stress of poverty. People are working multiple jobs, etc., which can reduce and produce poor child cognitive developments as measured by IQ tests. Now, one interesting example that I always like to highlight is this idea of rat park. Now, we all know studies of rats, putting rats into cages and allowing the rat to administer itself cocaine or being granted access to sugary foods or whatever drug or food that the rat really wants, and they'll keep pressing the lever to access that food or drug repeatedly until they die or get too fat or obese, whatever. Well, interestingly, researchers have found that if you put animals in kind of in this example, rat park, that is kind of like the Disney World of rat parks. Like, you got everything a rat would want. They got cheese or whatever it is that rats like. Well, what they found is that when they put rats in rat park, the rats had more neurons, more synaptogenesis, and more glial cells in the Disney World for rats versus rats raised in isolations. So what this is getting at is when an environment is enriched, when rats in any species are in environments that optimize and emphasize the environmental inputs that are needed for positive development and reduce the amount of stressors within an environment that are harmful to development, such as overcrowding and in this case isolation, we see changes in their intelligence and their in their brain through more neurons and more advanced connections within their neural systems, which allow the rats to perform better on whatever their tests of memory are within these rats. So kind of an example of the environment impacting, and which is evident on a neurological level, the development or the cognitive development of children, and in this case rats. The Flynn effect. Phenomenon over the 20th century. Average IQ scores have increased in all countries studied. In the US, increase is 3 to 4 IQ points per decade. Countries where rates of infectious diseases are high have on average lower IQs, may harm brain development and strip body of nutrients. So what we're seeing here is that, you can look at the chart here, is that that every generation, IQ scores are increasing, or IQ test scores, I should say, are increasing. Now, is it that every 20 years some massive genetic shift that's impacting intelligence? This, innate intelligence, this measure of G, that one intelligence score, or, which seems far more likely, we're seeing differences in the environment that are leading to better IQ scores. Why might we be seeing, or what environmental factors are contributing to that generational increase in IQ scores? Well, one is that children today have more formal education. So you're interacting with course material and kind of approaches to learning that are tests within these IQ tests. So you're getting actually just more practice. You're having the opportunity for more development and within those specific skills that are tests in IQ tests. Improved nutrition and living conditions. So some countries have found decreases in poverty. So this is China, poverty rates have gone down. So, but that's been demonstrated in some other countries, but not as to kind of the extent of China. But the point here is that improved enrichment in environments by the lessening of poverty could be contributing to these advances in IQ generation after generation. Same thing with nutrition, and the same thing with kind of like the decreasing of infectious diseases, which may actually be physically harming brain development, which could reduce your scores on an IQ test. Scores of a group tested in 1932 fell alongside a bell-shaped curve with half below 100 and half above. Study shows that if children took the same test today, half would score above 120. So basically here, all this is showing is that if children today took the same test of 1932, they would vastly outperform previous cohorts. And it's not just, because we're some genetically somehow smarter within 70, 80, 90 years. It's that these environmental influences on IQ test scores. IQ and test performance. Adolescents with high IQs are less likely to drop out of high school than lower IQ peers. So ask yourself, why do you think that might be the case? We saw on the previous slide all those correlations with IQ test scores: affectionate parenting, poverty, chronic stress, overcrowding, loud noise. So why might it be that adolescents with high IQ are less likely to drop out of high school than lower IQ peers? Well, we might have a directionality problem, right? Is it that the IQ is leading to, an individual's IQ is leading to dropping out? Or is it this extra factor, this poverty, this stress that's impacting IQ, and then that IQ test score then is predicting dropping out? So it might be this third variable, or this collection of third variables. It's difficult to untangle what specific aspects of poverty, of sexism, racism, or ableism, or etc., that could be driving this effect of, or this association between IQ test scores and likelihood of dropping out of high school. IQ test scores do not predict long-term college achievement as well. Habits, interests, and motivation affect academic achievement. So you can be great at IQ test scores, but if you don't give a shit about this test or of this class, you're not interested, you don't care, then you're not going to perform as well. Motivation, interests, and habits matter. IQ correlates highly on the SAT and GRE scores, which again, GRE scores are kind of a test that you take to get into some graduate school programs. But GRE scores do not predict graduate school success well. Many universities are dropping the GRE as a requirement. So the idea here is that even though the IQ scores correlate with GRE test scores, GRE test scores do not predict how well you'll do in a master's program, in a PhD program. And it's to such an extent that many universities are no longer requiring GRE test scores because they're so worthless in predicting how successful an individual is going to be in a PhD program. So now I want to move on to kind of the history of, or at least some history of IQ test scores, or kind of intelligent test scores. And I want to specifically look at the eugenics movement. This movement was really worried about low IQ in certain groups, and it contributed to the eugenics movement. A study found disproportionately high impact of the Latino population, primarily women and men from Mexico, were forced to be sterilized when institutionalized. So the eugenic movement said, okay, we have to sterilize people that we find as having quote-unquote low IQ because we want to cleanse the gene pool of low IQ individuals. And not shockingly enough, this is going to impact the most marginalized populations within a society. Forced sterilization and immigration laws were the most visible impacts on society. In 1927, a Supreme Court case on sterilization of 18-year-old, the Supreme Court justice says, by sterilizing this 18-year-old, we will remove, quote, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. So by sterilizing this person, we're stopping kind of this intergeneration of imbeciles, according to the Supreme Court justice. The Immigration Restriction Act of 1924, immigrants of the lower grades of intelligence and immigrants who are making excessive contributions to our feeble-minded, insane, criminal, other socially adequate classes. So this is kind of the social ills of society being blamed on individuals who perform poorly on a specific IQ test, leading to a loss of rights and sterilization for thousands of individuals across the country. Another historical legacy, or I should say a kind of an origin story of intelligent testing and college admission tests was highlighted in this new kind of set of documents that was found very recently from the University of Texas, which found that the University of Texas attempted to use college admission tests to limit the amount of black college students into their university. So as segregation was less and less enforced, universities had to develop strategies to circumvent that decrease in segregation. And one of which was these college admission tests. And because, as we saw, that these college admission tests or IQ tests correlate with your experience with taking these tests and with certain environmental factors, one way to limit certain populations, and in this case, Black American college applicants from attending university, was to assign them or make them take tests that they were unfamiliar with culturally, and thus kind of say, oh, you do not have quote-unquote good intelligence, and therefore you are not able to make it, you would not be able to make it in this university. So kind of just in this long legacy of in this case here, acknowledging almost the environmental associations with college admission tests at least, and then using that to your advantage to keep out black students out of the University of Texas. Changes in the environment. Adverse child events, ACEs, which we've talked about, and environmental stressors predict IQ test scores. Cumulative effect, that is, the more you add, the faster your IQ test scores dropped. So studies have looked at individuals who have the exact kind of IQ or similar kind of tasks at 2 years of age, for example. So they look at groups of children who scored the exact same on these intelligent scores, or scoring exactly the same on these intelligent tasks at, say, 2 years old. And then they follow, okay, well, this child belongs to a family who's in a higher class, is richer. This child is in a lower class or is poor or lives in poverty. And you're able to see the trajectory of the intelligent test scores, those IQ test scores throughout time. And not surprisingly, even though individuals will start with the same or very close to the same exact IQ test scores, they diverge, with with children of richer families scoring higher on these IQ tests, and the children in lower classes, those children living in poverty, scoring worse over time. So you can see the split, even though they started in exactly the same place. And those stressors are cumulative. So the more of those environmental stressors you add to a child, the worse they perform over time on these IQ tests. Let's look at Head Start and explore environmental influences on IQ, or I should say other environmental influences on IQ test scores. Those who think IQ is fixed tend to take fewer academic risks, challenging themselves less. So the idea here is that if you believe that your intelligence, your IQ is set in stone, you can't change it at all, you're going to act in accordance. What's the point of trying in school if you believe that intelligence is fixed? It's unmovable. It is what it is. Amount of schooling seems to exert a causal influence on IQ. IQ drops during summer vacation. Students who drop out of high school have lower IQs than those. We've already talked about that. So we see this cross-culturally too, that as the more you attend school, the higher your IQ scores will be for each year you attend. It basically increases X amount of IQ points. And during the summer, when there is no schooling, and especially for poorer children, you see drops in their IQ test scores. Early intervention programs such as Head Start produce short-term increases in IQ test scores. They reduce the likelihood of being held back in school, as well as high school dropout rates. However, many tests or studies have found that the long-term effects of the developmental benefits of the Head Start program are short-lived. And what do you think that might be? Well, one argument is that if you remember those cumulative stressors, it's really not fair and possible for Head Start, this 1 year program to compete against and protect against years of cumulative stressors. You need a much larger and longer Head Start program, and to address poverty in other ways. That Head Start, is not going to solve poverty. You need, going back to Bronfenbrenner, changes at those macro systems. Expectancy effects for self-fulfilling prophecy. Tendency of researchers to unintentionally influence the outcome of studies. So a famous study is the Harvard test of inflicted acquisition. And what these Harvard researchers did was they labeled their students, a group of students, as bloomers, and another set as kind of just not bloomers. So what happened was the Harvard scientists told teachers, okay, this group of students right here, these are the bloomers, they're the best, whatever, the highest IQ testing students, and the others, whatever, they're average or even below average. Well, fun fact, that was completely made up. Harvard lied to the teachers, and they just wanted to see what would happen if teachers believed that set of students were bloomers, were the high achieving students. Well, what they found was that the 20% labeled as bloomers in the classroom, that is 20% of the students were labeled as bloomers, they scored 4 IQ points higher than the other students when measured a year later. So again, these groups are completely made up but by Harvard scientists telling teachers and parents, presumably, that these 20% of children are bloomers, it actually increased IQ test scores a year later. So why might that be? Good question. So let's look at race and ethnicities. Most studies find race and ethnic differences in IQ test scores, but that is at the average level. There are wide variabilities within any race and ethnicity and gender. However, most research does not find evidence for genetic difference between races. So, for example, a study conducted in Germany shortly after World War II compared the IQ test scores of children of black American soldiers and white German mothers with the children of white American soldiers and white German mothers. In both groups, mothers raised their children. There were no differences in IQ test scores. So what we're seeing here is kind of a mixed racial child raised by a white mother versus a child with both white parents raised by a white mother, and then they compared IQ test scores. Well, children did not; those two groups of children did not differ in IQ test scores, aka that's measuring that this theoretical biological basis for IQ test scores should have an effect, and theoretically, if that was true, reduce test scores within the mixed children's IQ test scores. However, there was no difference found, which indicates that there is no kind of this innate racial difference in IQ test scores that IQ test scores pick up. Other studies examine whether black Americans with white European ancestry obtain a quote-unquote boost in IQ relative to those with fewer white European ancestors, which would be expected if racial differences were genetic. No differences in IQ test scores. So you can look at black Americans with more white ancestors and compare their scores of black Americans with less white ancestors and then test their IQ test scores. Well, there are no differences between the two groups on IQ test scores, aka again, evidence that these IQ test scores are not measuring this biological innate racial inferiority along these or anything like that, but instead suggesting that it's environmental influences such as poverty, racial discrimination, etc., that is correlated with racial and ethnic differences in IQ test scores, and really driving the difference in those scores. Now, stereotype threat: fear that one will be judged to have the qualities associated with negative stereotypes. A meta-analysis on SAT test scores found stereotype threats account for 40 points of the score gap between white, black, and Hispanic students. Mentors increase task performance. So the idea here, and researchers have found, and that this fear that you will be judged to have the qualities associated with negative stereotypes. So you have internalized those racial stereotypes, those gender stereotypes, etc. Well, that affects your performance on SAT test scores, for example. So kind of just even that threat, that the belief that you are fulfilling those stereotypes decreases your performance on intelligence tests, in this case SAT tests. And meta-analysis support this, that large variations in scores on the SAT task is related to this stereotype threat. And interestingly, mentors often same race and same gender mentors, but not always, but kind of effective mentors can decrease that stereotype threat and consequently increase performance on these, in this case, an SAT test score. Achievement motivation. Children's beliefs about their competence predicts their performance. Some researchers argue that it's not so much what you have, your ability, your talent, your intelligence, but how you think about what you have. And I mentioned that in a few slides earlier. That is fixed mindset versus growth mindset. Fixed mindset is believing that your abilities and talents are fixed or static. You have the talent or you don't. There's little reason to put forth great effort on the task. So if you believe that your ability to perform well in calculus, math, English, etc. is innate, is fixed, it's determined either at birth or some period that is long gone, what is the point of trying to perform well on that task? What is the point of trying to learn? There's really, not a lot of not a lot of points to performing well on that task or trying, because you can't change your intelligence because it's fixed. This is in comparison to growth mindset, which you believe the abilities and talent are malleable. You're motivated to put forth effort, and it's fostered by praising students' efforts/process, not the end product. So the idea here is trust the process. What matters is your approach to learning, because learning is an iterative process that requires multiple trials and sustained motivation to learn and achieve your goals. So you can see these are two different mindsets that can contribute to student outcomes, or, in kind of applied to our previous slides, IQ test scores. Child contributions. Before age 7, children are unrealistic optimists. They get better at accurate evaluation as they age, and they understand feedback better. Young children may give up if their failures are clear-cut, or they conclude they have bad or equate success with being a good or bad person. So all this is saying is that if a child believes that that fixed mindset, but also this can be children can contribute to this mindset, that believing that because they're bad or because they're whatever, they've committed, their poor performance on a task is reflective of who they are as a person. Now let's look at learning goals. Believing that ability is a changeable quality, and improvement abilities can be improved with work, protects children from damaging self-perceptions after failure. Growth mindset, which we already talked about. In the U.S., as children age, they see ability as a fixed trait. They aim to prove their ability rather to improve it, and seek to be judged smart rather than dumb. So this gets back to that idea that when we talked about creativity, and convergent thinking, that as children age, they become more focused on convergent thinking, less creative, and now we see they begin to believe that intelligence is a fixed trait. And they seek to prove how smart they are, and seek to be judged as smart rather than dumb. So again, not really focusing on that process of learning, that growth mindset, but rather achieving performance goals within a classroom setting, and across even outside a classroom setting. And why might that be? Could it be, some researchers argue, that because we emphasize grades and are so obsessed with certain types of kind of rote memorization, and really the end product, and establishing students who are gifted, etc., are performing in a classroom, that as a result, students begin to kind of adopt the values that are embedded within those educational and societal decisions. Mastery and performance goals. Let's look at two different types of goals here. Children mastery/learning goals tend to be better in school than those who adopt fixed mindsets and switch to performance goals. The process of learning is enjoyable, satisfies curiosity, and have higher levels of academic achievement. Children who focus on performance goals because the outcome of the grade is the goal, not the process of learning, report higher anxiety, which is negatively associated with achievement. Motivation and achievement is higher when children value a subject, they believe it is important, and their interest in the subject. So you can see how all these cognitives, these psychological components are embedded in society, and specifically looking at schools, but not just schools, but all around us. And so children who adapt those masteries, those learning, those growth mindsets, are less likely, to adopt fixed mindsets, and are more interested in the process of learning. They find that process enjoyable in itself. That curiosity, that discovery is what children are looking for, not just this performance goal, which is, again, kind of the grade, that end product, not the process. Those children actually report higher anxiety, which is negatively associated with achievement. So ironically enough, they're more anxious, which has negative effects on its own developmentally, but it also is associated with less achievement. So there's actually a lot of great literature on this that talks about our society's emphasis on grades and a less emphasis or no emphasis on that process of learning. So have you found that to be common in your experience, that focusing on a grade, being obsessed about a grade, uh, makes you more anxious, makes you less curious, makes you more of a convergent thinker? And would mastery goals or learning goals that are tied really to that intrinsic motivation, that those inner goals, not defined by grades, have you found that when you perform and focus on those type of goals, are they more rewarding? Are they less anxious? Do you enjoy the process of learning more? And research typically finds that the case is yes, children enjoy learning more when they're focused on mastering goals. Parent contributions to motivation. Parents tend to hold mindsets about failure as either debilitating or enhancing. Children pick up parental mindsets about failure, and these help shape children's own mindsets about intelligence. So if a parent is constantly stating that you performed poorly on this task, so therefore you're a bum, you suck. Well, the child is kind of going to internalize those goals, those learning, that approach to intelligence, and so they are going to internalize those values. And we saw that they occur at a classroom level, children internalizing those goals, reducing creativity, etc. But it can also be transmitted through parenting, obviously. Providing balance of structure for daily activities without holding unrealistic expectations, offering consistent and supportive responses to children's activities, presenting opportunities to children to observe healthy responses to life challenges. So the idea here is that these kind of 3 bullet points, of course, accounting for cultural differences, contribute to children adopting certain forms of motivation, which can actually harm learning in the process. Family capital. Parents who have higher levels of income, occupational status, and other qualities favored in society have family capital. It's a form of power that can be used to improve a child's education. Parents who do not have these qualities may find it more difficult to be effectively involved. A study found that teachers seek a particular type of involvement from particular types of parents. Teachers were most receptive to support, praise, and agreement coming from parents who were most similar in race and social class with the teachers. Parents who criticized the school's or its policies were less likely to be given voice. So let's unpack this. And we understand this in all aspects of society, right? If you are, a doctor, a nuclear engineer, something that has some kind of that has some kind of status associated with it, you have more capital, social capital, but in this case, we're going to refer to it as family capital, that allows you to have more power to achieve whatever is your goals in your environment. So in this case, complaining to a teacher or being, influencing the curriculum or, how a teacher interacts with the student. And people are human, and so teachers are among the humans who will recognize that family capital and be influenced by it, and which can be harmful for minority students and poor students, because you're obviously going to be less likely to be in those prestigious jobs that we have in our culture, have less money, and thus have less family capital, aka less cultural power to influence decision making or the decisions that are made within a particular context. School contributions to motivation. Study told 5th graders in a classroom they had low ability and some were told that they had high ability. Half were given performance goals, that is performance compared with other children and evaluated by an expert, they were told. Typical goals of a classroom. Half were given mastery goals. They were told working on tasks sharpen the mind and help them at school. So half of the students were told, okay, you are going to be graded and you're going to be evaluated by an expert on this task, while the other half of students were told, okay, just work on this task, but this task, even though it's difficult, is designed to sharpen your mind, to allow for your improvement, and it'll help them eventually in school, even though it's challenging now. Only children who became frustrated and gave up believed they had low ability and were in the performance goal group. Trying and failing over and over again just reinforces they are stupid, not a great feeling. Low ability students who pursued mastery persisted despite failures. So even though this task was challenging, the children who became frustrated and gave up were the children in the performance group, because they believed that their performance was tied to their ability, that fixed mindset, that, okay, how we rate me as a person is through this performance, through this grade, through this rating. So if I'm performing badly, that represents that performance reflects the fact that I am dumb, that I do not have this ability, that there's no point of trying, so I'm going to give up because I don't want to feel bad about myself. I see that this performance on this task is tied to my ability, which is innate, it's static, it's unmovable. So why would I keep trying it? Not only is it a waste of time, but it makes me feel really bad about myself. Well, if you have mastery, the mastery goal group continued on despite that failure, because they believe that even though this is a struggle in the short term, this struggle will pay off in the long term because it'll help them with school, and it helps them shape their overall kind of problem-solving abilities. School contributions. Studies suggest children are better off if teachers nurture intrinsic motivation to master challenges rather than performance goals. Now, I've mentioned intrinsic motivation multiple times, and basically what I mean by that is the child is motivated by internal goals. It allows children to view their mistake as a sign to change strategies, to improve their competencies on a task, rather than proof that they are dumb. So you have basically extrinsic motivation, that is performing a task for a grade, for money, versus intrinsic motivation, which is your own internal goals. Schools who offer lots of money for getting good grades do not produce improvements of standardized testing, studies have found. Schools who offer less money and targeting behaviors that children can control and already perform, such as reading, and not grades. So this study basically found that, counterintuitively to many people, that if you gave children a ton of money, the more money you gave to a child, the worse they perform on a task, because they're really just focused on the extrinsic motivation. They want that performance goal, and that performance goal is tied to their own ability, versus that intrinsic motivation, that I want to learn this thing, I'm committed to it, I understand that even though I'm going to struggle with this maybe initially, I am interested in this, I want to learn it, and I understand it's not necessarily a reflection of me as a person, but rather this process, trust the process of learning and effective learning. Academic achievement on average tends to be higher in schools with economically advantaged students. Children are better able to make academic progress in school when their homes have computers, books, and intellectually stimulating choice. Again, we've talked about this over and over again in these classes. Poverty decreases your family capital. It decreases the resources available to you. It makes you more stressed out, and all those things contribute to a lack of stimulation in the home and lack of resources, less books, etc. Effective classrooms emphasize academics. They demand a lot from students, expect them to succeed, and work hard to achieve classroom objective. They're task-oriented but comfortable atmosphere. They manage discipline problems effectively and foster an atmosphere of social cohesion, so everyone feels like they have a stake in the group and success. So just kind of establishing classroom dynamics, that everyone's a valued member of the group. I have high expectations for you. Now, mastery goals does not mean, you get to do whatever you want. No, but they're reasonable. It goes back to that scaffolding, recognizing the strengths and weaknesses of children, allowing them to have challenges, but challenges that they can meet, and emphasizing the process of learning, the mastery of learning, and their intrinsic motivation to learn, which are natural among all humans, but vary among different subjects, which you should all know and have experience with. Cross-cultural, we'll look at this slightly, but basically just in the classroom, that there are different students from different cultures who behave differently because there are different cultural norms. So some cultures make more eye contact than others, some social distance more than others, some wait before speaking more than others. And some cultures prefer activities that emphasize cooperation rather than competition. It's just stuff to keep in mind within the classroom setting. No Child Left Behind. The No Child Left Behind Act was a federal legislation signed in 2002 by George W. Bush. The act compelled states to design school accountability systems based on annual student assessments in math and reading. In 2015, President Obama signed the Every Child Succeeds Act. There was a study that just released in 2021, a Harvard study, that found over the last decade, and the point was kind of just to evaluate these federal legislation programs in education. Well, it found that 0 to modest positive effects on student achievement in the targeted areas for math and English language arts. Common Core had a negative effect on student achievement in non-targeted subjects, such as science and social studies, and the negative effect is largest for underprivileged students, exacerbating racial and social and economic student achievement gaps. So this program, this No Child Left Behind program / in Common Core, which is built on it, well, Harvard found that there was no positive effects, and in fact, negative effects on in sciences, and it exacerbated already achievement gaps, learning gaps within students, in lower class students, and in different racial groups. Self-concept. Belief about general personal identity include person attributes such as one's age, physical characteristics, behaviors, competencies. By age 8, self-conceptions emphasize psychological and social qualities. They use funny personality trait terms to describe the self. They define themselves as part of a social group and are more capable of social comparison. So as children age, they start using these personality trait terms, they define themselves in social groups, and they're more capable of social comparison. So using that information from others to determine how good they are. So if you're playing baseball I'm playing baseball and I'm just striking out and I'm garbage, and I see my classmate just home run after home run, I'm able to evaluate that, hey, I'm probably not that good at baseball right now. All right, now let's look at self-esteem. So this researcher called Harder found that self-esteem becomes more differentiated or multidimensional with age. By mid-elementary school, children differentiate among scholastic competence, social acceptance, behavioral conduct, athletic competence, and physical appearance. So they're able to recognize that people perform differently on different tasks, and then they're able to socially compare themselves and evaluate themselves on how well they do on these kind of different components of self-esteem. Now let's look at moral reasoning from the cognitive developmental theory. The cognitive developmental theories study morality via development of moral reasoning. Thinking process is involved in deciding whether an act is right or wrong. Moral development is assumed to depend on social cognitive development. Moral reasoning, it's argued by these researchers, progress through universal stages. Each represents a consistent way of thinking about moral issues. Everyone follows the same sequence. Concerned with how we decide what to do, not what we decide to do. So what they're looking at here is the process by which you decide your moral choices. All right, so let's look at moral understandings. Piaget and Kohlberg argued, well, Kohlberg did not much to say about children, except that they're mostly pre-conventional moral reasoners. He studied 10-year-olds. Rules are external to the self rather than internalized. 3-year-olds can take both intentions and consequences into account. By age 4, children's moral thinking becomes more sophisticated. So although Kohlberg didn't have a lot to say at this age, before 10 years old, we're still going to talk about it now because it's before kind of that adolescent period, so I'm going to include it right now. And it's talked about in the book. So Kohlberg's stages of moral reasoning. Moral growth progresses through 3 broad moral levels, and he is he believes in the cognitive social theory of moral development that I just reviewed a couple slides ago. Pre-conventional morality, which are that rules are external to the self rather than internalized. Conventional morality, individual has internalized many moral values. And post-conventional morality, individual defines what is right in terms of broad principles of justice. So we kind of have 3 different stages of moral development, but within each stage there are actually a few or a couple sub-stages, but these are kind of like the 3 broad overview ones. So we're going for like rules are external to self, rules are internalized, then rules are these broad principles of justice. Influences on moral thinking. Kohlberg believed the main influences on moral development are cognitive growth and social interaction with peers. Children need Piaget's formal operation thinking, that is, thinking abstractly and purely hypothetical possibilities. So I have to ask you a prompt, a moral question that doesn't actually exist, and you have to be able to imagine that hypothetical, that abstract concept, and then kind of weigh your options. So you need that cognitive development stage, Kohlberg argues, to reason morally. Moral growth is facilitated by discussions about moral issues, advanced schooling, going to college, and participating in complex democratic societies, he argues, where people weigh various opinions and appreciate the laws, reflect a consensus of citizens. So this is his argument. Okay, so this is a classic example. So basically, and it's really not that hard to imagine. Say your wife has a chronic illness, and the drug exists their drug exists, but the drug company is charging 10 times the amount of rate that it costs to produce. The husband tries to borrow money, and they try every legal way that he can to be able to pay for the drug treatment, but he can't. So the husband is desperate and considers breaking into the store to steal the drug. Now, what should the husband do? Pre-conventional morality, he should steal the drug because he can get away with it, or he shouldn't because he might get caught. So again, that's external consequences. Your decision based on if the husband should steal from the drugstore is based on external circumstances, external punishment. Conventional morality, others will look down on him if he lets his wife down. It's against the law. So this is kind of like rules-based, but you've kind of internalized the law. And I'm not really worried about as much about the punishment, but it's the fact that I've internalized the law as like good. It's and by me acting or breaking the law, I'm not acting good, or I'm disrespecting this law. While even should steal the drug, others will look down on him. So it's kind of, again, this idea that I have internalized what it means to be a husband, and now I have failed as being a husband. Versus post-conventional morality. Now look at the difference here, and it becomes pretty clear. He should steal the drug because the protection of human life is a higher moral principle that can overrule laws against stealing. So this is kind of this universal truth that states that, yeah, the law may be telling you can't steal that drug, but this is an unjust law, and I have to break it. Versus he shouldn't steal the drug. Doing so violates a basic social contract, thou shalt not steal. So the idea here is, yes, it's stealing. The issue is that by stealing, you are part of this larger ecosystem of criminals that can bring about the fall of civilization, which itself would kind of be unjust. So these larger kind of contextual questions of justice on a kind of universal scale versus, look at pre-conventional, just literally, will I get punished or not? And again, you are focused on the process by which a person comes to the decision, not the decision that they make. Children who pass theory of mind tests are more forgiving when a wrong is committed accidentally, better able to distinguish between lying and having one's facts wrong, and more attuned to other people's feelings and welfare. So this argument is basically that theory of mind, recognizing other people's perspectives, allows me to be in tune with other people's feelings, why they're acting a certain way, and being able to distinguish whether someone is lying or not. Children distinguish between different kinds of rules. Children are able to know the difference between moral rules and social conventional rules. Moral rules are standards that focus on the welfare and basic rights of individuals. They're absolute, sacred, and unchangeable. Some studies have found that 3-year-olds believe violations of these rules deserve more punishment. Don't beat up the teacher. So the idea here is that you never violate these rules. You don't ever punch the teacher. They're absolute. They're sacred, and they're focused on kind of the welfare of society or specific individuals. First is social conventional rules, which are standards determined by social consensus that tells us what is appropriate in particular social settings. Don't leave classroom without permission. So the idea here is that we kind of just have a set of rules that are maybe needed for the functioning of this task or in this particular moment, in this particular environment, but they're like not universal, they're not absolute or secret. You can leave the classroom if there's a fire, for example. Moral socialization. Hoffman weighed the pros and cons of 3 major approaches to disciplining children: love withdrawal, power assertion, and induction. Love withdrawal is withholding attention, affection, or approval until after a child misbehaves, creating anxiety by threatening a loss of reinforcement from parents. Power assertion is the using power to threaten, chastise, administer spankings. Induction, which is explaining to a child why behavior is wrong and should be changed by emphasizing how it affects some people. It invokes empathy. So basically, this is kind of just an approach to disciplining children, and there's 3 approaches, and they rely on different things. Some just pure raw dominance. This is wrong because I'm in charge, and what I say goes. Versus kind of explaining to a child why the behavior is wrong and should be changed, and emphasizing how it affects other people. Versus kind of this withholding of love and affection, which kind of creates an anxiety of a child that they want to follow the rules, or kind of you will withdraw from the child. So literally love withdrawal. And that's just 3 different approaches to disciplining children. Okay, let's move on to peer acceptance. I'm just looking at some categories of peer acceptance. That's generally this is kind of the main arguments of researchers, these categories. And that is that their peer acceptance are in the popular category, rejected category, neglected, controversial, and average. So children are well liked by most and rarely disliked in the popular, and rejected, they're rarely liked, and just average, you're kind of in the middle of both the liked and the disliked scales. So why are children more popular than others? Why are some children more popular than others? Physically attractive children are more liked. Social competence predicts popularity. Rejected children are often highly aggressive, and some are socially isolated, submissive children. Neglected children have good social skills, are non-aggressive, tend to be shy and unassertive. So social competence predicts popularity is a key point here. If you don't know how to interact with other people, people are not going to like you, and you're probably going to be rejected. So in the case of a rejected child, you're highly aggressive, and typically this is how these children are sorted. So the aggressive ones are rejected more, and so a child is not going to want to hang out with you if you're like punching them, for example. So you kind of get grouped with among other children who are also highly aggressive. Now, what are the implications of some of that grouping? Children who are neglected by peers often gain greater acceptance later, possibly because they have reasonably good social skills. Poorer outcomes are more likely among extremely withdrawn children. Children who are rejected due to aggressive behavior are likely to maintain the rejected status from year to year. They become more poorly adjusted as a result of being rejected, lose opportunities to learn social skills. So going back to that example, children kind of get sorted into a rejected group because they have poor social skills. They're probably more aggressive, and then because they're in that rejected group among other aggressive peers, they will experience less social interaction, thus they learn less social skills, which makes them more antisocial, and then you kind of get this cascading effect. Training helps kids improve interaction skills and acceptance by peers. So this doesn't have to continue. You can there are training programs available that teach children how to interact in pro-social ways with their peers. All right, so let's look at friendship. Study of 7 to 8-year-olds, 39% of children rejected by peers had at least one mutual friend. 31% of popular children lack such a friendship. Having at least one friend increases the odds that a child will be happy and socially competent and reduces the odds that a child will become depressed. Most protective when a child is well-adjusted and supportive, teaches how emotionally intimate, and paves the way for romantic relationships. So the idea here is that friendships are protective from stress at the household, if that friendship, is a healthy friendship among positive peers. And friendship allows children to practice how to be intimate with someone, how to reveal truths, how to interact with another individual, depend on another individual. So it kind of paves the way. It's this training ground for future adult romantic relationships. Social class, economic hardship, and parenting. Wealthy families have accumulated more wealth, while other families have seen little improvements in their finances or have lost what little they have had as a result of foreclosures, unemployment, housing foreclosures, and evictions. Parents dealing with poverty and economic hardships tend to be inconsistent and sometimes harsh in parenting. Poverty disproportionately affects children under 6, female-headed households, and minority children. So just the idea here is that social class and economic hardship affects parenting, which can affect then child motivation, parenting strategies, discipline strategies, etc. So one theory that looks at this is the family stress model, which centers on the negative effects of financial stresses on parental mental health, parenting, and child development. Parents who experience financial problems feel economic pressure, tend to make them depressed, and increase conflict with the family. It disrupts each parent's ability to be an effective parent. Both parents and children experience stress as they cope with the environment, which is noisy, polluted, crowded. Social environments are often unstable and violent. So the idea here is that in this family stress model is that once an experience stressor happens, whether it be losing a house, losing a job, that disrupts that system, that family dynamic. So it's kind of the Bronfenbrenner system approach again, these macro structures or these neighborhood structures impacting the family dynamics. And once those family dynamics are interrupted, they can have cascading effects. One parent being stressed can affect another, which can reduce effective parenting, which can then affect a child, which can then affect make a child rejected at school, etc. So that's kind of just one developmental pathway by which financial stress harms development in the household among the parents and the child. Cultural values and socialization goals. Poor parents have more worries about their children's welfare than wealthier parents do. They're more likely to become victims of violence, become teen parents, or come in contact with the police. Higher class parents may reason more with their children and foster initiative and creativity because their attributes account for business, executive, professional jobs. Lower class parents may emphasize the obedience to authority figures in part because that is required. So it could be that one reason why certain groups of individuals or poor individuals, poor children, and particular races, which would be disproportionately minority races, may emphasize kind of performance goals or obedience to authority, more specifically in this example, is that because they live that life. It's adaptive to, or at least short-term adaptive. We understand that adaptation has strengths and weaknesses, but it allows you to not get fired from your job. You're treated like garbage, and if you speak up in a particular scenario, you might get fired. Then you lose your job, and now you're in deep trouble. So parents pass down those values, that approach to interacting in the world to their children. Well, higher class parents may say, oh, well, you need to be creative, you need to be in the arts, you need to be in music, etc., because that's what counts for the fields that I expect to be in, what I expect as a rich person or as a higher class person having more wealth. I expect my children to end up in certain professions which emphasize certain skills. And not only that, but because I am worried about your physical health as a poor parent, of being bullied, kidnapped, etc., you can see the chart here, I need you to listen when I tell you to do something, because it's dangerous if you don't. So you need to obey authorities more for your safety. So it's an adaptation to your environment. And financial stress is associated with a bunch of problems, which we've already talked about. The worst effects of poverty are those that are experienced early in life and last for many years. Historical cultural findings. So basically this chart is just kind of what is known as deaths of despair. And that is the idea that white, non-Hispanic adults without a high school degree have seen their life expectancy decline really over the last handful of years, which is really kind of unprecedented in the United States or in any country. And the idea is that deindustrialization, loss of autonomy, loss of identity within the culture has led to loneliness and higher rates of drug use that has been harmful to the developmental outcomes of this cohort of people. And I just included other charts that show suicide rates cross-culturally and how specific historical periods such as the Great Depression and New Deal impact those developmental outcomes or those mental health outcomes. I'm going to skip this. We'll skip reviewing this. Look at diverse family experiences. Majority of 18 to 29-year-olds are unmarried. Reasons for cohabitation include convenience, trial marriage, or alternatives to marriage. So now we're in a historical period right now for many reasons where marriage is not as common for these 18 to 29-year-olds. And there's 3 different reasons as listed below. And I want to look at a couple more slides here. Dual care families. Working parents experience spillover effects. So this is what we talked about before, that cascading effect. Ways in which events at work affect home life and events at home carry over into the workplace. Parents' stressful day at work can lead to withdrawal from spouse and children after work. No indication that mothers working has damaging effects on the development, but the U.S. has no national policy of paid family sick leave. So if you have a child and finances are tight, that can lead to spillover effects across your marriage, which can be harmful. And one of those reasons, again, kind of going back to the profit-burner approach, is that the United States' lack of national paid sick leave can make the likelihood of those spillover effects from financial stress occurring more likely. Gay and lesbian families. Gay and lesbian relationships evolve through the same stages of development as heterosexual couples. Relationships are usually egalitarian. Parents share responsibility equally and tend to work out division of labor based on who is talented at whatever task. Lesbian mothers are similar to heterosexual mothers. And legal barriers can make parenting challenging. A study found that the well-being of children was associated with the social climate of the area in which the family lived with support of sexual minorities. So although developmental outcomes are similar / the same for gay and lesbian families, the environment that you live in is important, shockingly. So if you live in a neighborhood that's discriminatory against LGBT families, you are at a higher risk for well-being for your child and for the family. And finally, COVID. 37,000 American children lost at least one parent to COVID-19. Approximately 43,000 if you include indirect deaths from COVID-19, which is a 20% increase in the number of children who typically lose a parent each year. Black children were disproportionately affected, as 20% of children who lost a parent to COVID-19 were Black Americans, even though they only make up 14% of the U.S. population. Research on online learning shows that it can be effective only if students have access to resources that they need, and if their teachers are trained in online instruction. Class and race is associated with fewer resources critical for online learning. Food insecurities. Schools face big challenges to continue to meet nutritional needs of children. Hardest hit have been those who are homeless. So kind of what we already know. Those who are poorer, who are in lower classes, who are racial minorities, so historically disenfranchised in times of large trauma, the people who are going to be disproportionately impacted are going to be those groups of people, which poses a developmental challenge moving forward. And it's something to think about how we address these developmental stressors in this historical era. So thanks everyone for tuning in. I'll see you next week. Have a great week.